Deb. My name is Jackie Jamison. I'll share my contact information at the end of this slideshow, and you're welcome to reach out to me if you have questions. This is a topic I'm super excited and passionate about. I've been working for the better part of a couple of decades in soil health in some way, shape, or form. So I could talk for quite a while on these topics, but I'm going to try and condense it down into about an hour and a half of talking at you-ish. And like they said, there'll be plenty of time for questions kind of broken down throughout segments of my presentation. So feel free, if you think of it, write it down, whatever it is. Remember your questions because there will be plenty of time for questions as we move forward. Just to expand a little bit, as Christy mentioned, I was an extension educator in Twin Falls quite a few years ago, and that's how I first connected with your group. And there I was an instructor specifically in soil health. So I was working with large scale growers, up to thousands of acres on practices that they could use to help regenerate and build their soil health. Back in Hawaii, I live on Maui and I've worn a couple different hats. When I first moved here, I was working with the Master Gardener program and urban horticulture. So I was working on like the exact opposite scale that I was in Idaho with super small scale growers and gardeners, like it sounds like many of you. And so I've kind of run the gamut as far as scale of growing operations from a couple square feet to thousands of acres. So that's been really fun. Currently, I'm working more in a research role than an education one, although I still really enjoy giving presentations and sharing information and having great discussions with folks. But right now, I'm in more of a research role. In kind of a combination of soil health and irrigation and how drought stress can be at least somewhat mitigated potentially by the use of cover crops and crop rotation. So a focus on cover crops in drought stress conditions and how they can be used not only to mitigate drought stress, but also to build soil health. So feel free to ask questions about any of that as we move forward. I won't be talking about it a ton, but I did want to point that out just as it's kind of what I'm working on now. And Christy mentioned already, but I work with the University of Hawaii now. And if you all are not familiar with the extension program within the university system, all land-grant colleges, land-grant universities in the US have an extension program whose job essentially is to bring research-based information to the public, whether it's growers, families, gardeners, etc. So really, really great resource. University of Idaho has some incredible resources and humans that are working really actively in soil health and other aspects of gardening and growing. So definitely a resource worth tapping into. So I guess without further ado, we will move into more or less what I call a soil health primer. Where we're going today, we will break down and give kind of a rough definition of what soil is so that we're all on the same page. Many of us, well, all of us probably have an idea of what soil is, but we're trying to have a shared vocabulary. That's kind of the intention at the beginning here. We'll go straight from that into defining soil health, which is obviously the title of my presentation. And then we'll jump into one of, well, the most important component or element of soil health in my mind, organic matter. We'll talk about the structure and function of different portions of organic matter. We'll talk about what organic matter does in a lot of different facets of soil and gardening. And then we'll break down some of the who in the picture. Who are the living organisms that are doing this fantastic work of breaking down organic matter and making nutrients available to plants, etc. After we kind of talk through organic matter and what makes up soil health, we'll dive into a better understanding and kind of like field assessments for understanding where your soil health is in your garden, your farm, etc. So ways to go out in the field and get a good idea of like, is my soil healthy? Or, what are some things that I can maybe improve upon? When we talk about that, I can't really present anything on soils without talking a little bit about soil sampling and soil testing, because it is a pretty critical component of understanding what your soil is, kind of at the core before breaking down into soil health. If we have time, which I kind of doubt, but it will be included in a PDF that I'll share with Christy. If we have time, I'll hop into some bonus content and talk through some plant nutrients, and how to maybe start diagnosing what nutrients might be missing in your soil, that might be showing some symptoms in your plants. Sound good? All right. So as I mentioned, we are going to talk about what is soil. The Soil Science Society of America defines soil as the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. It's a pretty boring definition, but I guess it'll suffice. So essentially the stuff that plants grow in. But it's so much more than that. If you've done any sort of studies on soil, you've probably seen some iteration of this kind of pie chart. It breaks down the components of soil, and all of these should be like squiggly lines between rather than straight, because these are all pretty variable depending on the condition of your soil. But it can be broken down roughly into about half solid matter, so broken into mineral material. So this is your sand, silt, and clay, and organic material. Although organic material we're going to focus a lot of time on today, it really only makes up a relatively small portion of the soil as a whole, but it plays an absolutely important role in soil health and soil functioning. And I think it's important to mention that about half of soil is actually just pore space. It's open, and it's filled either with air or water. And depending on management, that pore space can be significantly reduced via compaction, which isn't a good thing, because that pore space is the site of dissolution of nutrients. So dissolving nutrients happens in water in the pore spaces of soil, and exchange of gases happens in air. So both soil air and soil water are absolutely integral for growing any kind of plants. What does soil do? Well, a lot of things. It has an important role in water storage and filtration. It's a medium for plant growth, which I'm sure we're all aware of at this point. It's important in nutrient cycling. So the living soil is important in nutrient cycling. We're going to talk about that quite a bit. It makes up habitat for soil organisms. And it's also an engineering medium. So gardeners and farmers aren't the only ones interested in understanding soils. Builders, construction workers, road builders, etc., need to understand soil properties in order to adequately design buildings, structures, roads, to work with the soil properties at hand. So I'm going to break down the component parts of soil just to, again, get kind of a shared vocabulary here and understanding, kind of combining like Soils 101 and a soil health primer here. So soil minerals, again, I mentioned earlier, they make up about 45%. That could be plus or minus 10% or more potentially of soil. So soil minerals consist of sand, which is the largest particle size in soil, silt, which is kind of a medium, moderate sized particle in soil, and clay, which is a microscopic, tiny, tiny, tiny particle in soil. However, even though it's microscopic and it's tiny and we can't see it, clay plays an absolutely important role in the exchange and storage of both nutrients and water in soil. Clay, because it's so small, has a high surface area to volume ratio. So it's able to hold on to water. It's the site of chemical reactions. It's an important site also of biological activity. And it provides like little nooks and crannies for different organisms to exist and live. The surfaces of clay are also importantly charged, positive or negatively. And so that impacts how they react with different nutrients in soil. So this will become important as we're talking about things like cation exchange capacity and chelation. Soil texture, as I mentioned, so soil mineral particles can be broken down into sand, silt, and clay, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the texture triangle is a way of kind of delineating what physical structure your soil has based on the amount of clay, the proportional amount of clay, silt, and sand in your soil. So if you look up a soil analysis for your area, you're going to likely find a description that might say silty clay loam or sandy clay. And you can use this type of triangle. They're all over the place in soil science textbooks and online. You can understand roughly what the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in your soil is. And this is important because it impacts water dynamics. So how quickly water drains or pools or doesn't drain from your soil. It impacts nutrient availability because it can impact the amount of pore space in there, and also the clay in there can impact nutrient availability. And it also importantly impacts physical qualities. So it has important roles that it plays in root growth and in workability. So whether you're using shovels or hand trowels or a tiller or a large tractor, your workability and how the soil is going to react after any kind of tillage event or something similar is going to be largely determined by the physical qualities of your soil. Soil water, as I mentioned, is the location where all nutrients get dissolved and become available for plants. So it's absolutely important. As any of you have seen, in the high summer, you need to add a lot of water via irrigation. If you don't, a lot of times you'll start to see not only wilting, but you'll start to see some nutrient deficiencies as well because the plant simply can't take up those nutrients because they're not dissolved in water. So soil water, as I mentioned, can make up anywhere from 10% or less up to 40% or more of soil. So quite a bit depending on the saturation level. And soil air, the last component other than my favorite that we're going to talk about, is determined by soil texture and by management. I mentioned earlier that we can impact that pore space by different modes of management. So tillage typically will create some kind of hard pan and or compaction down lower in the soil profile, reducing the amount of pore space and thus reducing the amount of air and water that are able to be stored in your soil, and thus reducing the amount of gas exchange that can happen. So roots aren't able to grow through it physically, but they're also not able to exchange air, with the environment around them. Roots need to breathe too. So ways that you can improve drainage, adding organic matter and adding gypsum. This is actually really important where I work in Hawaii here. Most of my test plots are in a location with really heavy clay soils to the point where we just had a big rain 2 days ago and I'm getting ready to plant a cover crop trial and I can't do it for another 2 weeks because I need the soil to dry out. And we add gypsum on a regular basis to help flocculate the clay particles and allow water to move through. So moving on to my favorite component of soils, soil organic matter. Who in there can tell me something that they know about, like how do you know whether and how much soil organic matter is present? Any ideas? Color?
Did you hear
Was that color?
if worms are there?
Yeah, worms are a great indicator species, absolutely. You won't typically find worms in soils with no organic matter, that's for sure. I typically look for color a lot of times can be a good indicator, and sometimes smell as well, if you're up for sniffing a little bit of soil. But typically in soil organic matter, you find nutrients present, like in the top horizons of soil. As you get lower in the soil profile, those nutrients are fewer and farther between. And a lot of that is a result of the organic matter being present higher in the soil profile and a lot less being present lower in the soil profile. Uniquely, organic matter is both a source and a sink for nutrients. So it's a source for nutrients because decomposition breaks down organic materials and turns them into plant available nutrients. And mineralization is the process by which soil microbes are able to transform organic forms of nutrients into mineral forms that plants are able to take up. Organic matter also acts as a sink for nutrients in the soil. Similar to clay, organic matter has charged surfaces, and plant nutrients are charged ions. Many of them are positively charged specifically. And so the charged surface of organic matter, as with clay, is able to hold on to and make available plant nutrients when they need them. It also acts as a sink for nutrients by increasing the cation exchange capacity of soil. We're going to break that down a little bit more later on in my presentation, but the cation exchange capacity is essentially the capacity for soil to not only hold on to, but change over, so turn over cations, like I said, plant nutrients, ammonium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those are all cations that are super important for plant growth, and organic matter can help cycle those through the soil. I want to point out a valuable tool that some of you, can you all raise your hand if you've heard of Web Soil Survey? Very cool. Okay, so I'm not going to spend any time on it because I feel like a primer on Web Soil Survey could eat up my entire time, but I do want to put a little nod towards the Web Soil Survey because now that you all have at least a little bit of shared vocabulary around what soil is, what the components are, and what some of them do, you are now able to read and understand at least portions of what you can find on the Web Soil Survey. It's an amazing resource put out by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service that essentially has mapped data of soils that have been looked at by NRCS soil scientists and breaks it down by type. So you can see on the left-hand side here, the column, I tried to pull up a map of Idaho Falls for this guy. But it breaks down the types of soils that you see in that area. So Bannock loam, Bach loam, Harston fine sandy loam. These are all soil series present within this map unit. And then you can click on each of those and it'll give you information about the pH, about the salinity, about the type of soil, like the soil structure. It'll give you information about the cation exchange capacity, bulk density, all super important and valuable things to know. And again, I just wanted to put out there that this tool exists and is an extremely valuable resource when looking at potential new ground to grow on. Maybe you want to pull up like your backyard, or maybe you have friends that are starting a farm and trying to look for land. This would be a really good place to start to understand, what your opportunities and limitations may be in terms of soil. So very valuable resource. I highly recommend just playing around with it a little bit. And I'm sure you'll learn a lot if you do. So we're going to dive in here to what is healthy soil. I have time built in, I believe, in 2 or 3 slides for some questions. So think about any of the questions that you may be marinating on. I'm going to introduce what is healthy soil, and then we're going to dive into a question session. So I think many of us, when we look at soil, kind of have, especially if we have some experience gardening or farming, have kind of like an intuitive idea of what healthy soil might look like, feel like, smell like. So that soil on the left-hand side with the thermometer in it, would you come up to that and be like, oh yeah, that's healthy soil, that looks good to me? Anybody raise your hand if you think that? Right. versus the soil on the right-hand side. I heard when I asked about organic matter earlier, someone was saying, oh, earthworms. I can see 3 earthworms in like a finger-sized portion of that bottom right soil. I see plenty of soil clinging to the roots in the top right soil. Those are both from growers that I worked with in and near Twin Falls, who are implementing soil health practices on their farms and seeing some of these incredible results. Whereas the left-hand picture is fallow ground on another farm that I was working at, where the temperature of the soil, I think, was up at about 100 degrees, so well above air temperature. Soil was bare, it was compacted, and just no one would call it healthy soil. So again, we have kind of this like intuitive understanding and sense of what healthy soil is. And some of the characteristics that might come to mind when we throw out words related to healthy soil are like good tilth. So physical structure is good. Sufficient depth, so you can go down deep in the soil before hitting any sort of restrictive layer. You get good water storage and drainage after rain events, so you're not seeing like ponding and things on the surface. You have sufficient nutrients. This is a bit of a trickier one, or can be, but sufficient nutrients for growing plants. You may have to add some things depending on what your base soil is. Typically, a healthy soil is going to be free of contaminants and harmful chemicals. You'll see a relatively small portion or population of pests, diseases, and weeds. And you'll tend to see a larger and more diverse population of beneficial organisms. And last but not least, in healthy soil, you will always see organic matter. And the interesting thing about a lot of the soils in southern Idaho, where you all are living and working, is that the natural state of organic matter is really low in a lot of those soils. And so you can make a really big difference in your soil health by increasing your soil organic matter by 1%. Some of the soils that I was working with in and around Twin Falls, their starting soil organic matter was like 2% or less. So really low to start out with. So you can have a very large effect by increasing organic matter. If we want to define soil health as we did soil in general, soil health can be defined as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So you can see right off the bat that this definition goes a lot farther than the definition of soil itself. Soil itself being, just the implies some kind of innate thing that plants can grow in. But this definition gives us a bit more kind of information about what soils actually do. So a healthy soil is functional. A healthy soil is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem includes both the environment and the organisms that are a part of it. And it sustains plants, animals, and humans. So that implies some kind of sustainability of soil health in the ability to grow plants, in the ability to support human ecosystems and human habitats. So I like this definition because it does give us quite a bit more. It gives soil a bit more credit for what it does, I suppose. And soil health, as we'll talk about when we get into some of the assessments and understanding soil health, can really be broken down into 3 kind of buckets. We can talk about biological properties, chemical properties, and physical properties. And all of these kind of come together to create healthy soil. So a lot of emphasis in the past, decades or even centuries of agronomy research has really just put so much emphasis on the chemical properties of soil. So the information that you get from a standard soil test, your pH, your salinity, your nutrients, etc. And that's only one piece of the puzzle, right? That's a part that's easy to understand in the lab via analyses. And there's a whole lot of emphasis put on it, especially in commercial systems. But that leaves out 2 really important parts and players in healthy soil: the biological properties, which we're going to focus on quite a bit after this break, and the physical properties that are largely influenced by those biological properties. So with that load of information there, kind of giving us a shared vocabulary and introduction to both soil and soil health, I did want to take a few minutes and open up to any questions that might be out there at this point.
So just stick your hand up if you have a question and we'll let you holler it at Jackie. Yes.
Azomite, how does that change the soil chemistry? What benefits does it provide as its own independent amendment and or in conjunction with?
Azomite is, as I understand it, and I haven't researched it a ton, but azomite is primarily a micronutrient amendment. So it's going to provide certain micronutrients, and that's something that you could just apply pre-plant. And it's not those amounts that are in azomite are so trace that I don't think you're going to see negative effects from it. But you could also use soil tests to guide you as far as like whether you want to add azomite or something like green sand or other micronutrient sources based on what micronutrients might specifically be lacking in your system.
Yeah.
Okay, it might be addressed later, but I have a friend, the only place that she can garden right now has a giant pine tree near it that drops needles everywhere, so obviously it's very acidic. Is there a way to help balance it out and get the pH levels back to a functional thing? Because the tree can't go anywhere right now.
Great question. I actually deal with the same challenge here, although it's not pine trees. It's not true pine trees. It's cook pine trees. But similar kind of acidity coming from the needles. And there are a couple of different ways to moderate your pH. One of them is to lime your soil. Depending how long those pine trees have been there, they may or may not have the pH may or may not have actually decreased in the whole area. It might just be in the very, very surface. So I'd recommend your friend to get a soil test, understand what the starting pH is, because the pH in a lot of soils in southern Idaho is actually quite high and alkaline. And so you might not be dealing with too much acidity in your soil because the pine actually might be mitigating more towards neutral, if that makes sense. So I would recommend actually testing it. And you can even do that yourself with like test pH strips, that kind of thing. Like get a sample of soil, put it in water. There's directions in like $5 kits that you can buy on Amazon to look at your pH. And it's one of the most important metrics you can understand for understanding nutrient availability. So first, I would try and understand what your pH is to start with. If your pH is indeed really low or acidic, then you can think about different strategies to increase your pH more towards neutral or about 6.5 or 7. And those things are lime. So different things like gypsum, dolomite, limestone itself, agricultural lime, that kind of thing can be used. But the amount you want to use is going to depend on what your starting pH is. So again, just important to understand what your starting pH is. Excuse me. And then it is an amazing characteristic of organic matter that organic matter is actually able to buffer pH, whether you have an alkaline soil or a more basic soil or an acidic soil. Organic matter is able to make the soil function more like it is a neutral soil because it has the charged surfaces on it that are able to hold onto and release both hydrogen and H plus and OH minus ions, which essentially determine your pH. Adding organic matter can help you buffer either way. So that's a really valuable tool. And most compost actually is slightly alkaline. So adding compost is going to help you there as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Awesome.
So much. Thank you.
Great.
Jackie, I have a question for you relative to organic matter. Is there a relatively simple way that people can assess in their community or backyard garden what their level of organic matter is?
So without sending a sample off to a lab for a soil analysis, you can't know exactly what it is. but there are certain clues that can give you an idea, and I'll break this down a little bit more later in my presentation. But you can look at clues and understand kind of relative to neighboring soil, for example. Is this organic matter higher or lower? Based on things like, I think color is a really magical tool that you can look at to understand what organic matter levels are, but that's all relative, right? There's no simple tool that I know of to quantify the organic matter unless you send out your samples to a lab.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. I think we're good.
All right, moving on then. So as I mentioned, this kind of next block of time, we're going to be really focusing on soil organic matter. When I first started learning about soils and fertility, I was pretty immediately infatuated. And I remember laughing because my instructor at the time in a permaculture course that I was in had us all sit down and say, organic matter. And I thought it was funny at the time. So I bring it up every time I talk about organic matter now, but it really is kind of the linchpin, the key to so much when we're thinking about how we can optimize our soil health and our soil functionality with respect to growing plants and gardening, the things that, most of you are probably there to learn about. Before we talk about some of the wonderful things that organic matter does in our soil, I do want to break it down, again, give us a bit of a shared vocabulary into 3 components. So there's one resource that I'll share with you at the end of this presentation called Better Soils for Better Crops. It's a fantastic Western or SARE, Sustainable Agriculture Research Education, maybe, publication. There's a lot of free resources out there, and this is one that I absolutely love, and it's an oldie but goodie. And it breaks down soil organic matter into 3 main chunks, or 3 main kind of like buckets. They break it down into the living, the dead, and the very dead. It's simple. But actually, I like it better than any complex soil science explanation of organic matter. And I think it does a better job of making us understand what the function of different types of organic matter are. So the living organic matter makes up only about 5% of the total organic matter. This is where the soil food web exists. This is where the organisms that actually drive decomposition and nutrient cycling live. So all of those living organisms only make up by like volume or weight about 5% of soil organic matter. That's not to say that their importance is only 5%. They're absolute drivers of so much of the functionality of healthy soil, but the amount of space that they take up is actually pretty small. The dead, I like to think of, it's around 30 to 50% of organic matter. But the dead, I like to think of as the active portion of organic matter. I like to think of it this way because this is the portion of organic matter that's readily available for microbes to access. So this is their food. This is the food for bacteria, for fungi, etc. And by acting as fuel, as food, these organisms directly release nutrients from that organic matter into the soil. This is also the portion that changes most readily with management. So changing and say adopting soil health practices like incorporating cover crops into your practice or using organic mulches in your garden. These things can change the active portion of organic matter pretty relatively quickly. So that's kind of cool as well. And then the last portion, a lot of people call humus, kind of incorrectly, if I'll say so. But I like to think of the very dead as the stable organic matter. So this is organic matter that's protected in some way from decomposition by attachment to soil particles or location within the soil matrix. This stable organic matter doesn't provide necessarily fuel or food for microbes, and it doesn't even really give nutrients into the soil. It's largely carbon, inaccessible to microbes, but it is absolutely integral and important for physical structure and water holding. So it's what holds aggregates like clumps of soil together with those microbial glues. It provides all these nooks and crannies for microbes to live. It provides pore space and tilth that can be used for exchanging gases if it's filled with air, or hold onto water and act like a sponge. So again, I think of the living as, that's pretty self-explanatory. The living organisms that are driving the processes that make soil healthy. The dead is the active portion of organic matter, makes up about half of the rest. And then the very dead of that stable organic matter that really is important in physical structure of soil and the physical components that are enhanced by soil organic matter. What does organic matter do? Simple, right? Organic matter does a lot. And the intention of this diagram isn't to show you everything that organic matter does. We're going to break down some of the most important things that organic matter does. But more so just to show you that adding organic matter into a system, whether it's a garden or a farm, has this whole cascade of effects. It's not just as simple, you add organic matter, you increase your nutrients. No, there's a whole lot of other things that are going on. And if you look at this, none of these things are negative. Yeah, these are all positive effects of adding organic matter. That's a really cool thing about adding organic matter as opposed to adding, say, a synthetic fertilizer. You add a synthetic fertilizer, it's a known quantity. You're adding N, P, and K, let's say. You have 10% of each. Let's say you're using 10. You have 10% each of N, P, and K that you're adding, and that's what you're going to get. Like what you see is what you get, face value for fertilizers like that. Whereas if you add organic matter, yeah, you might be adding it to get some nutrient value, but you have all of these other wonderful side effects or byproducts of adding organic matter as well. So you get you get more bang for your buck. And ultimately, healthy soils promote healthy plants, promote healthy soils. They're dependent on one another. So let's break down some of these key functions of organic matter. What does organic matter do? It does, as I mentioned, a lot of things. And one of those that's pretty key to a lot of gardeners and growers is nutrient availability. What exactly does it do? So the most straightforward answer is that it feeds plants directly as it's decomposed. So organic matter can release nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. Depending on the composition of that organic matter, it can provide all kinds of nutrients into your system over time. Excuse me. And the release of those nutrients, again, is contingent upon having a healthy ecosystem of living organisms that are actually doing that decomposition, yeah? Organic matter also enhances nutrient storage and protection. So as I mentioned earlier, there's something called a cation exchange capacity, which both clay and organic matter contribute to. This is the capacity of soil to not only hold on to, but release cations, many plant nutrients, into soil solution to make them readily available to plants. Organic matter also plays an important role in a process called chelation, which I'm going to break down in just a minute. But chelation is an important process for making micronutrients, especially things like iron and zinc, available for plant use. And as I mentioned in response to one of the questions earlier, organic matter also buffers pH. So when I'm talking about a lot of the soils that you're working with in southern Idaho are actually alkaline, as I mentioned. So that means their pH is above 7. And in both alkaline and acidic soils, certain nutrients, and especially micronutrients, are not available to plants. So even if they show up on your soil test, they may not be available because of the pH of your soil. Now you can modify your pH at least short term by adding things like limestone or sulfur if you're trying to acidify it. But you can also more long-term impact the functionality of your soil and make nutrients available and buffer the pH through the use and addition of organic matter, which is really, really cool. And another thing that they can do as far as nutrient availability goes, and this is particularly important in Hawaii soils, and I'm pretty sure in Idaho soils as well, is that certain organisms in the soil actually solubilize phosphorus. So phosphorus is a key limiting ingredient in a lot of systems for plant growth. So it's one of the major three, NPK, right? But it's a limiting resource in many agricultural systems. And in a healthy soil ecosystem, you have certain organisms that are able to actually make phosphorus available for plants to take up, which is also very cool. And lastly, organic matter enhances nutrient availability kind of more indirectly by promoting larger and healthier root systems so that plants are able to take up more nutrients. They do this also by relating with soil organisms called mycorrhizae, so a type of fungus that has symbiotic relationship with plant roots that enables plant roots to extend their reach even farther to take up more nutrients and more water. As promised, a little bit of chemistry here, cation exchange and chelation. So you can see here many of the important nutrients for plants: potassium, magnesium, calcium, etc., being exchanged. They're positively charged, held on tightly, loosely by the negative charge on either clay molecules or organic matter. And the reason why it's called the cation exchange capacity is because those nutrients are readily exchanged between each other and between hydrogen ions, which is part of the reason why organic matter is able to buffer pH, right? Hydrogen ions determine your acidity level. Here's just a diagram. If you want to get deeper into this, you can research a bit more on cation exchange capacity. And then that last picture there with the zinc molecule in there, or the zinc molecule in there, is a picture of what chelation looks like. So this is where you have more complex organic molecules, essentially like hugging micronutrients and making them more available. So that allows those micronutrients to be accessible more to plants. So we've talked about some of the things that organic matter does in soil and the roles that it plays with nutrient availability, but I think it's important to mention that there's another component of the soil system that's required in order for those nutrients to become available to plants. And that component is water. These nutrients have to be dissolved in water in order to actually be taken up by plant roots. So you have the nutrient supply via clay and organic matter, but it's not going to be available unless you have water for it to get dissolved in and an appropriate pH for it to be accessible. So what else does organic matter do? I mentioned that the very dead component of organic matter is largely responsible for the structural, like the physical qualities that organic matter lends to soils. And so we're talking largely about that when we talk about some of these structural important functions of organic matter. Organic matter increases water holding capacity. It also increases something called aggregation. So aggregation is like the sticking together of soil particles into these like small, kind of looser, larger clumps of soil that can help in increasing your soil tilth, improving your drainage, etc. And organic matter does that by the use of what are elegantly called microbial glues. So these are substances, polysaccharides for the most part, so sugars produced by bacteria that actually stick together these particles. And it's also accomplished by fungal hyphae. So essentially like the roots of fungi help to hold together these soil particles. What does that do? It improves water infiltration and retention. So you can see the picture on the bottom there, a well-aggregated soil on the left-hand side, and then the aggregation on the right-hand side has been totally broken down, and the topsoil surface layer has just been like compacted. There's no pore space in there for water to run through. There's no pore space there for roots to exchange gas, and that soil is going to be a lot harder for roots to actually penetrate and grow through. Um, Aggregation also increases soil tilth and improves gas exchange. So super important qualities that organic matter lends to healthy soil. And organic matter also creates habitat and microstructure. This is super important for essentially creating an environment that's going to support a healthy ecosystem. And as I mentioned, ecosystem includes both the environment and the organisms that are there. These organisms that I'm going to break down in a little bit for you, these organisms are really the ones driving so many of the things that are involved in soil health, like nutrient cycling, water, etc. So these organisms need somewhere to live. And organic matter provides physical structure for them to live in. It protects them from predation. It provides these microclimates with higher or lower amounts of water, so it can provide like a diversity of habitat for organisms to live, and that diversity of habitat encourages a diversity of microbes to exist there. And who are these living organisms? Another complex image here of the soil food web, and this is actually an even simplified one. But you can see here, you may have learned, say in like third grade biology, the food chain. This is like a food chain on steroids, essentially. And ecosystems really are a lot more complex than their linear relationship of a food chain implies. And so the soil food web is a really good way of kind of depicting that, it's not a simple linear relationship, and organisms sometimes have multiple roles. And a lot of times there are multiple organisms that serve the same function. And that provides resiliency in a system. So this is where I'm talking about the diversity of organic organisms in the soil system allows for resiliency and sustainability of that system. So the first, what's called trophic level, feeds the whole soil food web. This first trophic level consists of primary producers. So this is organisms that are magically able to make their own food, which are plants. Some microorganisms, algae, etc., cyanobacteria, are able to do that as well. But the primary producers that we're mostly concerned with in garden and farm systems is plants. So plants are where everything essentially starts. The second trophic level is the herbivores. So these are the organisms that eat plants, whether they're dead or alive, and or the products of plants. So like sugars or residues that plants produce, either via their roots or their leaves. Anything that eats plants directly is a part of that second trophic level. And then the upper trophic levels feed on other organisms, aside from plants. So these can be the third trophic level if you're feeding directly on an herbivore, and so on and so on and so on, depending how high on the quote unquote food chain you are. So a healthy soil food web will have, again, multiple different players in each of the trophic levels, such that if one, maybe their population declines or they're more sensitive to soil pH that changes or something, if one goes away, then you still have others to satisfy their role, if that makes sense. And if we want to think about it a little bit differently, or maybe just encompass it in a fewer words, soil is a living factory of macroscopic and microscopic, macroscopic and microscopic workers who need food to eat and places to do their work. So they need nutrients, they need fuel, and they need habitat. And at the end of it all, plants are really the hub of life. I like this picture at the top left because it shows a really really good image of something called the rhizosheath. So this is like a thin layer right around the soil or right around the roots, the root and soil interface. And it's just a total hub of life. It's like an oasis for soil organisms because these roots are exuding all kinds of sugars and polysaccharides and plant compounds that microbes are feeding on and they're using to communicate. So microbes are able to thrive in this location right around the roots. Again, it's just like a haven for microbes. And as you get far away from it, typically the population and diversity of organisms will decrease. So this is just showing like at a microscopic level what's happening underground around plant roots, and lends to the importance of keeping living plants and plant roots in the soil as much as possible. So now's the fun part. We get to meet some of the players in here. First, we'll talk about kind of the macroscopic, the worms and arthropods, insects, that are kind of the larger players and the ones we can usually see with our naked eye. These guys, and especially earthworms, create large pores and holes in soil that scientists will call biopores. And these pores allow water to infiltrate down. They provide microclimates, microhabitats for other organisms. The slime that they produce provides food for other microorganisms, etc. And these guys, if you're thinking about it, they're like your tillers, right? Like they're moving up and down in the soil, moving organic matter up and down, and mostly down and lower into the soil profile. So worms alone can move like tons of organic material per acre per year. It happens right under your feet, so you don't even think about it. But if you quantify that, it's really quite amazing. Um, when we're talking about arthropods, so some of the insects involved, these are like shredders and chewers that can make more surface area available for decomposition. So these are some of the herbivores, first trophic level, that are eating plant material and organic matter and essentially breaking it down into smaller pieces that then microbes can access, right? And so they're giving a jump start to the decomposition process. And these guys, many arthropods also act as predators. So they're eating other smaller organisms within the soil ecosystem. And by eating those smaller organisms, they're releasing the energy and nutrients that those smaller organisms had within their bodies themselves, yeah? Making them available to plants in a process called mineralization. Bacteria, the microscopic wonders of soil, and sometimes macroscopic. If any of you have ever dug up a pea plant or a bean plant or some, leguminous cover crop, you can see what's pictured here on the right-hand side and then in microscopic view up top, these root nodules. And these nodules are something that plants make to house little bacteria called rhizobacteria. And these rhizobacteria are fertilizer factories in the soil. So they are able to turn nitrogen from the air. So our air is made up largely of nitrogen, but plants can't access it. Yeah. All of our proteins are made up of nitrogen, but we can't access it unless it comes from plants initially. And those plants that are able to turn nitrogen from the air into nitrogen fertilizer are called legumes largely, although there are non-legumes that can do it as well. And so this is one of the key bacteria that relate with plants and help cycle nitrogen specifically. But bacteria in general are the major players in cycling nutrients. They both immobilize and mineralize nutrients. So when I say mineralize, I talked about it earlier, but mineralize is basically when you take an organic compound that has lots of complex nutrients in it and minerals within it, and break it down into its constituent smaller parts. And these smaller parts are what are actually accessible to plant roots. So they're what plants can actually take up and use as nutrients or fertilizer. Immobilize is the opposite of that. So immobilization happens when bacteria actually take those nutrients and turn them into their own bodies, right? So they immobilize nutrients by taking them up into their own bodies. And then when they are either eaten or decomposed, those nutrients are released back into the soil system and made available to plants. Bacteria can help increase nutrient availability. They transform organic nitrogen into mineral nitrogen and vice versa. Bacteria are key players in dissolving phosphorus. Like I mentioned earlier, that's a really important limiting factor in a lot of agricultural systems. And bacteria are able to help chelate micronutrients to make them more available to plants. As I mentioned, bacteria are the players that are able to fix nitrogen. They're the fertilizer factories in both free living in the soil and in symbiosis with plants and rhizobia. And the bacteria are the ones that are one type of organism that's able to break down complex molecules like lignin. A specific type of bacteria called actinobacteria, which is a really ancient strain of bacteria, or type of bacteria. They're actually able to break down really complex molecules. We think a lot of times that it's only fungi that can do that, but bacteria are actually important players in that breakdown as well. And as I mentioned earlier, with respect to physical properties, bacteria secrete important compounds and glues that help aggregates stick together in soil. Bacteria are also increasingly being looked at for their ability to promote plant growth. So there's something called plant growth promoting bacteria, or PGPB, that are actually sold over the counter now in nurseries, et cetera, in order to help plants grow. And largely they do that by secreting plant hormones or plant hormone, what's the word I'm looking for? Things that are similar to plant hormones that basically mimic their effects. And lastly, the presence of many and diverse bacteria helps them compete against disease-causing organisms. So if you think of it like this giant bucket of organisms that exist, if you have it full of bacteria that either are beneficial for plants or that don't negatively or positively affect plants, and if a bad bacteria or disease-causing one comes in, they're just going to have no spot to live, right? And so if we are promoting the growth and health of our ecosystem for good bacteria and good fungi, then there's not going to be as much room, as many ecological niches to fill by disease-causing organisms. I'm not going to dwell on this cycle here. If you are interested in looking more into nitrogen cycle, it's a fascinating thing and there are books written about it. But I did want to point out, highlighted in the yellow here, how important bacteria specifically are for the cycling of nitrogen. So nitrogen, as we all probably know by now, is an absolutely integral plant nutrient in very high quantities as compared with other nutrients, right? And bacteria are specifically players in nearly every phase of the nitrogen cycle. So without bacteria, nitrogen essentially would not cycle through the ecosystem. Next are fungi. I feel like these are kind of gaining a lot more traction in the public sphere now for their importance, but for a long time were kind of silent players in the soil health world and just soil ecosystem in general. But fungi, I mentioned that actinobacteria, a type of bacteria, are important for breaking down like complex materials like lignin and cellulose that are present in wood. But fungi are really the main decomposers of these complex molecules. They break them down into smaller bits and pieces that other organisms can actually access and break down more completely. I want to take a minute to talk about mycorrhizae because they're so cool. So mycorrhizae are symbiotic fungi that form relationships with the roots of most plants, with very few exceptions. One notable one for gardening, though, is Brassica. So the Brassica family, which includes like broccoli and cabbage and mustard and arugula, they don't have mycorrhizal relationships, which is interesting. But most other land plants do. And these mycorrhizae help plants to acquire nutrients. They increase the surface area of the effective root zone to allow plants to access more nutrients and more water, really importantly. The hyphae, or the roots within there, help bind soil particles into aggregates, and they're increasingly being shown to be important in communication between plants, both of the same and different species. So mycorrhizae help connect the root networks of different plants and allow plants to communicate like, hey, I'm getting bitten by aphids right now. You should up your defenses so that when the aphids come to you, you're not as tasty to them. So this is a whole world of underground communication that's occurring in plants, and we're really just starting to scratch the surface and what's going on, and it's fascinating. Fungi, similar to bacteria, if we have a plethora of healthy fungi, they can help compete with disease-causing organisms. And interestingly, they can even be predatory. So this image at the bottom here is a picture of a nematode, so that like worm-looking thing, being wrangled by a predatory fungus. So this is a harmful nematode that's getting essentially killed, predated upon by a fungus. So that's pretty wild. Next, we're going to dive a little bit into nematodes and protozoa. I feel like these guys are very important players, but often don't receive enough or very much attention, except for when they cause diseases in plants. So yes, there are definitely disease-causing nematodes, and that's an important thing to watch out for in growing certain crops. But it's not the only place that they live. So nematodes and protozoa can also be really beneficial in the soil ecosystem. They feed on both organic matter directly and other organisms. And many, if not most of them, are actually grazers. So they help by eating other organisms. They help mineralize nutrients, so make nutrients available for plants. And I've seen studies of 50% or more of nitrogen actually coming directly from nematodes feeding and releasing that nitrogen. So pretty wild. And these guys are actually thought to be responsible for much of the nitrogen available in agricultural soils. So agricultural soils are not typically very high in nitrogen unless it's applied outside of the soil ecosystem. But the nitrogen that is available is thought to be largely coming from nematode feeding. And as I mentioned, some nematodes and protozoa can also be damaging to plants. But again, the more healthy population of healthy organisms you have, the less chance there is that damaging ones are going to be able to take hold. All right, I just gave you a lot more information about organic matter, about its role in soils, about different players that are involved as the living organisms within soil systems. Now I'd like to take a minute, or however long it takes, to answer any questions or entertain any kind of thoughts or concerns that have come up thus far.
Okay, are earwigs and or pill bugs good or bad for soil health?
The more life I see in soil is typically a positive thing. So I like seeing springtails and I don't mind seeing earwigs in my soil either, because if you think about it, those guys are typically going to be like breaking down organic matter, usually are slightly decomposing already organic matter, and just increasing the surface area of that to really allow other players, the microscopic players, to make nutrients directly available from that organic matter. So I typically see those as a positive sign in my soil.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What are some simple ways that we can add more organic matter?
Good question. Lots of ways. You can add materials like compost. You can use organic mulches, so wood chips, straw, anything that comes from plants. Using it in your soil system as a mulch around plants, eventually that's going to break down and turn into organic matter at the soil interface. You can incorporate cover crops. You can leave residues from your crops in the garden, assuming they're not disease-ridden or pest-ridden, in which case you'd want to compost them in a thermophilic pile. But those are just a few examples of ways that you can add organic matter into your system.
Anybody else? So I have one for you, Jackie.
Yeah.
Is there a reliable way to increase fungal populations in soil? Is that using wood chips and straw and that kind of thing?
Yeah, typically you're more recalcitrant, so more like resistant to decomposition, materials that are higher in carbon, like wood chips, like straw, like residues from, say, grassy cover crops, things like that are going to really do a lot to feed your fungal population.
Right.
And another thing is that fungi, perhaps, well, almost definitely more so than bacteria, are really sensitive to tillage. And so reducing, if not eliminating tillage from your system can allow fungal populations to grow faster and not be disturbed as readily.
Yes.
So back to your organic matter, you're talking about leaving residue, or let's say that you had, a large portion of your field or something that you had a bunch of pumpkins in or something, would you just leave them or would you try to break them up? Obviously without trying to disturb the soil, but to try to, smash those pumpkins or to kind of create more of a residue or just kind of leave the vegetables there?
That's a great question. And it's going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend how much work you want to do physically. And it depends on the timeline that you're going to want to plant that next round of crops. So in general, a general rule of thumb is that if you're able to increase the surface area of organic materials that you're adding to your system, whether it be shredding leaves or making wood chips as opposed to just adding branches, the more surface area that's present, the faster it's going to be accessible for decomposition by microbes, and the faster that organic material is going to turn into organic matter. So shredding it up is going to accelerate that process.
If you have a large area that's full of weeds and bad soil, you're not supposed to till, or I was gonna put solarization plastic on it, but now after watching this presentation, I'm thinking that would be bad for the microbes. So what would be the best way to make that so it's gardenable soil?
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question. It sounds like you're working with some bad soil. What makes it bad?
Well, just a large old weed. It's got crabgrass all over it, and it's just about an acre of just crabgrass and dry soil.
So one strategy that I really like for situations like that, where your challenge is weeds primarily, is a process called sheet mulching. Is that something you're familiar with?
Is it kind of like lasagna gardening?
Say that again.
Lasagna gardening?
Lasagna, kind of. So sheet mulching would be like putting down an opaque layer. One of my favorites is cardboard. If you have access to like burlap sacks or something like that, some kind of organic based material. So laying that down in an overlapping fashion and then covering that with some other kind of organic material. So my favorite is wood chips. If you have access to wood chips via an arborist or otherwise, and then watering that in really well, that cardboard is going to help hold down and essentially prevent light from getting to that crabgrass. And the mulch on top of it is just going to increase the amount of time that that's effective for before it breaks down. And underneath that, because it's all permeable to water, you're going to get this really positive, really great growth of organic material and of soil microbes that are going to be beneficial to your system. Things like crabgrass do take a little bit longer to kill off, and you do need to be careful that you have good overlap of your layers of cardboard or whatever you're using so that those gnarly rhizomes don't end up coming up in between. But that's one of my favorite strategies for dealing with something like that.
And there is a page on the website that gives instructions about how to do sheet mulching. We use it a lot in the garden. Yes.
How would you do that on a large scale?
A lot of minions. No, I'm just kidding. You might not adopt sheet mulching on a large scale unless you had the labor to support it. Although it is like, it's an input of a lot of labor and material at the outset, but the payback from it is really, really significant. And it's gonna, I guess the scale and your ability to do something like sheet mulching is going to depend on the resources at hand and the ultimate goal of what you're trying to do. I am definitely a proponent of reduced and no tillage whenever possible, but I also am a realist and I've worked with farmers and I've had my own farm where I do use tillage to jumpstart the system, to eliminate the large and really nasty weeds, and get them out of the system so that I can start really fresh. It's not something that I like to incorporate on a yearly or seasonal basis, but it is a tool in my toolbox that sometimes, if it's bad enough, I will use that strategy to get things started.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You were talking about soil structure and compaction. So if you have like that's super compacted, do you just put the organic material on the top, or you're not supposed to till it in? So you just have like a super compacted base and then a little bit of organic material on top, or how do you do that in?
So that's going to depend on your scale as well. If you're talking about like a small garden, there are strategies that you can use to overcome compaction that are really labor intensive. One of my favorite tools, and this is something that I've used even at a half acre or more scale, one of my favorite tools is the broad fork. If you're familiar with that, it's essentially like, it's not tillage because it's not inverting the soil, but it is aerating the soil at a deep level. Are you familiar with that tool, broad fork?
Yeah.
Awesome. So that's something that you can use to help incorporate some of those and help break up that compaction layer. If things are really bad and you're only doing it on a small area, double digging can be really beneficial, but that is even more labor intensive than broad forking. On a very large scale, I've seen people use something called a chisel plow or a subsoiler. Again, this is not a tool that you would want to use on a yearly or seasonal basis, but to jumpstart your system, if you're starting with something really bad, you could use something like a subsoiler on a larger scale, to break up that compaction and then start your really good soil health practices from there. So again, I'm not dogmatic in anything that I do. I'm realistic in the fact that sometimes using tools like tillage or subsoiling, etc., can have really, really, really great impact at the beginning of establishing a system. Not something that I'm going to depend on for regular use, but it can help jumpstart things.
Other questions? Jackie, I would like you, before you go on, to address the kind of common held perception that cover crops and leaving additional plants in the soil are taking from the soil and therefore depleting it instead of helping it.
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit right now, while we're thinking about it. So cover crops, yes, they use water and they use nutrients, but they also, when they're terminated and either incorporated or left as residue on the soil, they eventually break down and make those nutrients available again. So as with anything in agriculture, it's kind of a cost benefit analysis of what are you looking for? Like what are the functions that you're looking for in a cover crop system? Are you looking for, let's say, a fall cover crop because you had a high amount of nitrogen in your system and you don't want that nitrogen to leach away? You might actually want to incorporate like rye or some kind of nitrogen scavenging grass into your system in order to pull and hold on to that nitrogen so that it's not just lost to leaching over the winter, right? Whereas if you're working in a really nitrogen limited system, using something like ryegrass is going to immobilize, it's going to tie up that nitrogen and make it less available to plants when it's a residue form, because the high carbon to nitrogen ratio of that residue makes it such that nitrogen is not going to be available. So right place, right time, right situation is really important when thinking about which cover crops to use and the timing in which to use them. So I don't have like a blanket all-encompassing answer to that. I do have a response of like, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with those cover crops, and when you plan on using them in your crop rotation. And you can use that information to determine what are the species that are going to be best suited for you.
Okay, thanks.
Was that a good non-answer answer?
Well, it addresses the complexity of the question, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
Because it is a complex process that you need to sort out for your particular conditions and.
Yeah,
so-
and then one of the questions that I'm investigating in my current research with cover crops is the dynamic interplay between cover crops and water. Because in a location, and you all exist in one as well, where we're water limited, it's hard to swallow the idea of planting a cover crop and then even potentially irrigating a cover crop and using precious water resources to grow this cover crop when the cover crop itself is not producing your crop, right? But at that point, it becomes really important to play that cost benefit game. And it depends, is the answer even from the research, of whether there's a net gain in water availability from the use of cover crops because of their impacts and benefits and increases in organic matter that results from using them. So that just adds another layer of complexity.
Any other questions, folks? Okay, I think we're good.
Awesome. You all ready for more? Okay, so the next portion of my presentation is going to talk through how to know. How do you know if your soil is healthy? Like human health, health of soil can't actually be measured directly. So instead, we use something called indicators to assess how well a soil is performing important functions like water storage and infiltration, nutrient cycling, and providing habitat for soil organisms. So similar to when you go to the doctor and you get your blood pressure taken, or you get blood drawn, or you get, weighed on the scale. These are not actual measurements of your health per se, but they're measurements of indicators of your health. So your blood pressure can tell you certain things about your health, as can your weight, etc. Similarly with soil health, we're not looking at the overall health. We don't have a way to measure that directly, but we can look at different indicators to understand how healthy our soil is. My favorite tried and true method for soil health assessment in the field. And I do want to put out there that I'm going to talk about field assessments because I feel like these are the most relevant to most gardeners and even many farmers. But I do want to put a plug out there that there are like actual soil health tests, things like the Haney test you may have heard of, that are becoming increasingly popular for trying to quantify some of these indicators and measurements of these indicators and give like a soil health score that you can compare both against similar systems nearby or year after year. A lot of these soil health tests are still kind of in their infancy though, so it's important to know like soil chemical tests have been around for decades, centuries. They've been around for a long time to say like, okay, if my nitrogen level is reading this in a soil health or in a soil analysis, I know that I need to add X amount of fertilizer. Like those numbers are pretty well established for different soil types. Whereas soil health assessments are still very much in their infancy. They've been around for less than 10 years. And so in science terms, that's a very short time. And they're still being ground truths in a lot of locations. So they do exist. And they're most useful at this point for comparing, I would say, very similar locations and or change over time in the same location. But back to my field assessments, the shovel test. It's a simple way, and many of you are already doing it as you're digging in your soil and prepping your beds in the spring, as you're putting them to bed in the winter or fall, digging around and really just getting a feel for what the aggregates feel like. Is your soil moist underneath the surface? Does it feel like it has good tilth? Is there like a compaction layer you're getting to a few inches down? Might be something you want to address. You can also look at how compacted your soil is. And this can be done with a tool called a penetrometer that'll give you an actual number of compaction, or it can be done with something easy like a wire flag. Stick it down, shovel, stick it down. Does it easily penetrate the ground? This is a good proxy to understand how your roots, plant roots, are going to be experiencing the soil structure. Are they able to penetrate? Are they able to grow down? You can also dig up a plant like a root ball and see, are the plant roots able to kind of freely grow down, or are all the roots going horizontal at some layer? That might be an indication that you have a compaction layer at that point. You can also understand via shovel test or otherwise, does your soil have good structure? Do you see macropores? Can you see those biopores that say earthworms and arthropods are making in the soil? Is your soil kind of crumbly or is it granular? Can you see aggregates in your soil? Because that's an indication of like microbial glues and fungal hyphae helping to hold it all together. Do you see your plant roots covered in a rhizosheath? If you do, that's an indication that you've got a healthy soil microbial population, at least right immediately around the plant roots. Do you see evidence of biological activity and diversity? Do you see, like, as you're looking at it with a macroscopic view, do you see different types of soil organisms? Do you see earwigs and springtails and earthworms in a shovel full of soil? That's a good sign. Do you see channels, biopores, spaces where earthworms may have lived or where roots may have decomposed? That's also another good sign. This is an important one. I think that there's a lot to be learned from going out to your garden or farm immediately during or immediately after a rain event or a big irrigation event. Do you see ponding after irrigation? Do you see like flow of water through your garden on the surface? If so, you're losing valuable topsoil in that. And if you see ponding, it means your drainage is not very good. And you might have to do some work to increase the tilth and porosity of your soil. If there's crusting on the surface of your soil, that a lot of times indicates clays that shrink and swell, which you'll see in Idaho. I see certainly here in Hawaii. And that's a sign that you want to get more living roots and more living organisms in that soil, build that organic matter. An assessment for how much organic matter do you have? The question was asked earlier. In order to know for sure, quantifiably, you need to send a soil sample in, but you can get a lot of information by looking at the color of your soil, smelling your soil, jasmonic acid, things, beneficial compounds and organic matter have a very distinct earthy smell, and you can smell it when you dig up a good handful of healthy soil. And last, and this is a simple one and an indicator of good soil health management, is your soil covered? Is it covered by ideally living and growing plants? Secondarily, by some kind of organic mulch or sheet mulch? And one of the last and a very valuable tool for understanding not only soil health, but soil at large is using traditional soil tests. I kind of bashed them earlier when I was talking about soil chemistry and the chemical properties of soil just being overemphasized. That's not to say that understanding your soil chemistry is not important. It's just to say that it's not the only piece of the puzzle. Yeah. So understanding biology and understanding your physical structure and constraints and opportunities is just as important, if not sometimes more important, than understanding your soil chemistry. But again, that's not to say that using those traditional soil tests is not integrally important as well. So the importance of taking a soil sample, if you're sending it off to a lab for analysis, you can understand what nutrients are available in your soil immediately. You can understand, perhaps more importantly, what nutrients are lacking in your soil and when and what you might want to add into your soil before planting. So a lot of times, depending on the lab, you'll get recommendations for soil nutrients to add, and you can often request either conventional or organic amendments in those recommendations. And that, speaking to the question about azomite earlier, that's where you're going to understand like what micronutrients might be lacking, etc. So using those recommendations, you can calculate fertilizer needs, and just overall can help with your soil fertility management. In the long run, it can, if you're a farmer, it can help increase profits. If you're a gardener, it can help increase the amount of salsa you're going to eat later and can later in the season. And overall, it helps minimize losses and waste of space in your garden, which I know in community gardens is at quite a premium. Apologies, this slide is from a Hawaii presentation. We don't have a soils lab here in Hawaii, so we actually have to send all of our samples to the mainland labs for analysis. But typically, a soil test will come back and give you your pH, which is a very important metric. pH, as I mentioned earlier, is super important in determining what and how much of plant nutrients are going to be available for plants. And so understanding your pH, if you don't get anything else from the soil test, can help you understand better what you can do to manage your soil better. And salinity can serve as an indicator of perhaps over application of certain types of fertilizers or manures. And again, as I mentioned, pH can indicate nutrient availability. And if your pH is too high or too low, adding more nutrients that you're deficient in may not actually do anything until you fix the pH challenge. Soil test will also tell you what extractable nutrients you have. So extractable meaning dissolvable in certain chemicals. These nutrients primarily are calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium. Soil test will also tell you typically your total carbon or total organic carbon. It'll tell you your total nitrogen, which is typically low. Your boron and any other extractable micronutrients as per the test. So it might give you your iron, your zinc, your cobalt, your copper, etc. And again, these can also these may corroborate with visual assessments of plant deficiencies as well, and give you an indication of what micronutrients or macronutrients you need to apply to optimize plant growth. So anytime we're talking about soil sampling, or any kind of sampling, you want to be accurate and representative. Typically, I recommend people to collect soil samples in like a zigzag pattern to ensure that you're getting an accurate or an adequate sample from across the entire area that you're working with. And then putting those subsamples together into a composite sample, and then sending that in. So collecting, I think a good rule of thumb is about 5 to 10 subsamples, mixing them together into a composite sample, and then sending that out. So the reason, I think one of the most salient reasons that I recommend, and typically anyone will recommend this type of sampling protocol, is that if you were to sample just from one location, say, you're like, oh, I'm just going to go to the middle of the field because that should be representative of the whole area. I'll take a soil sample from there, I'll send it in, no issues. Well, what if that area that you chose was a spot where you spilled a cupful of fertilizer last year? Or a little area that got zero irrigation because it was outside of the drip line. All of these things can influence very largely a single soil sample, but if you have 10 subsamples, then that's all going to kind of come out in the wash. Just showing a picture, it can be done with tools as simple as a shovel or a trowel and a bucket. And just a reminder, like I just mentioned, results are only as good as your sampling program. This is a sample of a soil sample that I got done here in Hawaii relatively recently. You can see I just wanted to show you like the typical things that you'll get back from a soil analysis. You'll get a value. Often they'll give you a status. So this might be like high, very high, low, excess. And then it'll often give you an optimum range of those nutrients or things. And then often, especially if many places require you to pay extra for recommendations, but they'll have an agronomist look at your soil tests and see what needs to be added in order to optimize for whatever plants or crop you're trying to grow. So how can you improve soil health? This is a topic for a whole nother talk. And I think you're going to be talking about this a lot throughout the winter. But general strategies to keep in mind: keep your soil covered. whether it be, like I said, by living mulch, like plants, cover crops, etc., living roots of crops, of plants that you're trying to grow, straw, wood chips, any kind of organic material that you can use to keep your soil covered is going to be beneficial. Minimize soil disturbance. I don't like to say eliminate because there are certain times when desperate times can call for desperate measures, and sometimes tillage is a valuable tool that you can use in order to reset or restart your system. But generally, minimizing soil disturbance is a good rule of thumb. As I mentioned, fungi specifically are really sensitive to tillage and soil disturbance. Maximize biodiversity. Adding a diversity of fuel and food, whether it be living plants or mulches or organic matter, helps to increase the diversity of the organisms present in your soil, which in turn helps to build resiliency in your soil food web, increase soil nutrient cycling, etc. Maintain living roots in the ground as much as possible. Understanding that, during the winter, this becomes challenging, but maintaining living roots in the ground helps feed that soil ecosystem. Remember that slide where I showed the plants being kind of the hub of life because they're exuding all of these compounds and providing this like oasis in a desert of soil for organisms to live. Maintaining living roots in the ground helps sustain those populations. And lastly, integrate livestock when possible. I realize that at a garden scale, this isn't often possible, but sometimes things as simple as earthworms can be counted as livestock. If you think especially about the amount of organic material that they're moving in and out of the soil profile, those micro livestock are pretty important. But things like chickens and ducks can play important roles in gardens as well. Yeah. I've got a bunch of resources to share with you, a bunch of links. And then I would love to open it up to some more questions. And if there are no questions and you all are hungry for more information, we can move forward and talk more about plant nutrients, but I'd love to talk story a little bit. That's one thing that we say, if anyone has spent time in Hawaii, conversation and discussion is called talk story. So happy to talk story about soil health.
Go ahead.
Can you go back one slide to the resources?
Yes.
Thank you.
This will be on the website.
Oh,
So. But it's good to get it now, because I don't know how quick we are. Website guy is gonna be able to get it up.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a favorite lab that you send your soil samples to? Or a more accurate lab?
I don't. The soil, I can include this in the resources when I send it to Christy, but there is like an accreditation system for soil labs, and any accredited lab will be required to utilize the same standard procedures for analyzing soil. So as long as you're going with an accredited lab, the processes, protocols, procedures should be the same across the board. But you definitely want to look for an accredited lab, not just like Jane Smith out in Oklahoma who has a lab in her backyard, right?
Jackie, do you think it's possible through managing your soil with the various strategies you've outlined and that we'll be talking about as the season unfolds to create a garden soil that does not need additional chemical fertilizer, organic or otherwise, inputs?
Yes, I do. It depends what you're starting with to some degree. pH and nutrient availability to begin with is going to be important. Those are called inherent properties of soil, things that you can't quickly and easily change. So it is going to depend in part on that. But yes, I fundamentally do believe that you can do that. You may be specifically like trying to grow certain crops to accumulate and release certain nutrients at different times. And timing is going to be important. You're going to want to use cover crops and things like that timing of termination and incorporation, if you're doing that, is going to be critical for for when those nutrients are actually released back into the system and when they're available to plants. But absolutely, I do.
Right. Yes,
On a large scale, if sheet mulching is not available or wise to do, could you use it like a silage tarp for a short amount of time to kind of get things killed off that
Yes.
are not killed, but still keep? those
Yeah, are you
benefits?
talking about like terminating cover crops or weeds or things like that? Yeah. Yeah, and that's what a lot of like the No-Till Market Garden podcast, they host a lot of folks who use silage tarps or similar materials to terminate cover crops and to break down residue from crops to prepare seed beds for the next crop. Yeah, absolutely.
Since you've got some experience here in Twin Falls, which is close to us, what do you recommend that we can do to warm up the soil when we get ready to plant? If we cover it with black plastic, has a chance of getting it too hot, possibly sterilizing, killing some of those bacteria and such?
That's a tricky one. That's a tricky one because I feel like I don't know that I have a great answer for that, to be honest. One of the benefits that I've seen of organic matter is that it is darker in color. And your soils in southern Idaho are typically really light in color, at least inherently. And so higher organic matter in your soil is going to warm up the soil faster just because it's darker color, right? So that's one kind of like added benefit of organic matter. A challenge is because things like thick mulch, heavy mulch insulate the soil in both directions. So they make it cooler in the summer, but they also hold on to that cool longer, or can hold on to that cool longer into the spring. Um, I don't have a great answer for you on that. I'm gonna think on it.
Jackie, what do you think in answer to his question of combining a black plastic with organic mulch or compost placed under the plastic that can decompose over time, also mediate the amount of heat that the black plastic might accrue that was excessive, and give you the advantage of warming the soil a little bit?
Yeah, I could see that working, especially if you're not, if you're not keeping that black plastic on too late into the season, because then you run the risk of getting it too hot. The other thing is the decomposition process itself. If you have organic material that isn't fully decomposed, once it warms up enough to start that decomposition process, that releases heat.
So I've seen some things where some people will recommend, instead of having a compost bin where you break down the compost before you add it to your garden, just using a shovel and making a hole in your garden and then putting the stuff you're gonna compost, just like tucking it in there and then having it like go right back over and letting it break down in the soil. That'd be obviously like something you just do in your backyard. But do you know anything about that? Is that like reasonable to consider?
Yeah, so I have worked a little bit with like in-ground vermicompost systems. And I think those can be valuable. They don't heat up, which is nice. And you're containing that in a space that plants aren't actively accessing. The challenge with having like raw materials in your soil are twofold. So with decomposition, you get heat produced. So that could create too hot of an environment and either burn off certain beneficial organisms or impact your root growth such that the roots will not want to grow too close to it. So that heat, both like physical heat and heat like from production of ammonium, etc., can be harmful if it gets too much. And then the other piece is that using raw materials in your garden in too close proximity to things like leafy greens and stuff that you're going to harvest and eat directly does increase your likelihood of transmitting things like E. coli or listeria, just because those those harmful bacteria can be harbored on like rotting foods. So those are just the two cautions that I would give in using that strategy.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. So I'm like putting a bunch of sticks and stuff in my raised beds right now. And because I can't be like turning my compost right now, I've been just taking like organic matter out and putting them, like kind of spreading it around in the sticks. And then I'm gonna cover that with soil and like the soil that I'm gonna use for the raised beds. Do you think that's okay to be doing?
It sounds like you're doing something called hugelkultur.
Oh, okay.
Look it up. It's actually a strategy that can be really beneficial for building raised beds and building soil over time. Using like woody debris that takes a longer period of time to break down directly in your garden beds.
Do you think it's okay that I'm putting like coffee grounds and like orange peels and all of that within the sticks, like in the winter time? Right now?
I mean, the same cautions are going to apply to what I was just talking about. I don't quite give that same caution with coffee grounds. Like coffee grounds, you can add directly to your soil without negative impacts, at least that I've seen. But with citrus peels and other like produce directly that's not decomposed, yeah, the same cautions that I just gave would apply. But coffee grounds, I wouldn't see that as much of an issue at all.
Okay, that's good to know. Even if it's gonna be like buried in the summer. Do you think the caution would be less if it's gonna have like a layer of soil between?
Yeah, and especially since you have a lot of woody debris in there, it is going to compost in place. So then like depending on what your ratio of carbon and nitrogen is and like how active that decomposition is, that's when you might start to run into like heating up of your pile and causing harmful effects on your plants just from heat. But if it's a slow burn, slow breakdown, mostly of woody debris, I wouldn't be concerned about that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Talk about burning. Like front rock, stuff, using like the little flame, leaf burners.
Sorry, I only caught about half of that. What was the question?
That's something like burning, you know, for soil health. Like, you wanna burn the leaves off, that be bad for soil health.
Can you
I'm
burn
sorry.
the
Burning?
burning? Yes.
What about burning?
That be bad for soil health, it's like you wanted to do like the tarp and stuff, but maybe you wanted to get the big leaves first, can you burn it?
If you're actually burning material, you're getting rid of most of the carbon, most of the organic matter in that combustion process. So you're actually not, it's no longer organic matter. It's just going to be ash, right? It's different from the pyrolysis process that you might be thinking of with like something like biochar, which is a low oxygen environment. You're not actually burning it per se. You're pyrolyzing the material and making it essentially just carbon-based organic materials going in. And that can be quite beneficial to your soil and soil health. Did that answer your question?
Does that count for also just the, like a leaf burner, like the torch one that you would do that's not going down?
Oh, I see. Like if you're trying to burn weeds, say of like a carrot crop or something like that. Typically, I don't see those as having a strongly negative or long-lasting negative impact on soil health because they're just very superficial. So you're just killing the very, very like thread weeds. Like you're not holding that torch on the soil for a long period of time. It's just a very superficial surface level burn of those weeds. So I wouldn't be concerned about that in soil health, at least not significantly.
Any other questions? Okay, Jackie, let's move on to your bonus material.
All right. So I included this as bonus content. I just taught a class to beginning farmers here on Maui and on Oahu. And I did it, it was a more of a soil fertility focus, but I figured I'd include this here in case folks were interested in doing a little detective work. And using plants to better understand nutrient status of soil and your system. So starting this out with a caveat that nutrients in soil, which is what we've been talking about, isn't necessarily equivalent to nutrients that are actually available to plants. So we can use plants themselves to help us diagnose certain nutrient deficiencies or even toxicities, and better manage our cropping systems, our garden, to make sure that we are promoting optimum growth and don't have any serious deficiencies in our plants. So before we break down individual nutrients, I want to talk a little bit about what essential plant nutrients are. So plant nutrients are those nutrients that are needed to help a crop complete its life cycle. They may be most important in vegetative growth. They may be barely used in vegetative and almost entirely used in seed production. So they could be cyclical in nature, dependent on where in the plant's growth cycle we are, or they could be needed throughout. But these nutrients essentially are plant food. We have primary macronutrients, which are your things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the things like NPK that you see on any soil fertilizer bag or bottle. Then you have your secondary macronutrients, things like sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, which are also extremely important to plants, but in smaller quantities than the macronutrients. And then you have your micronutrients. I've talked a lot about these because these are very largely pH dependent on their availability. But these are things that are required in just very small trace amounts. So I want to point out that a common misconception that the thought that primary macronutrients are, because they're called primary and because they're called macro, more important in some way than the micronutrients. That's not the case at all. All of these nutrients are necessary for plant growth. It's just the amount of them that's necessary for plant growth and optimal growth. And really it comes down to balance being key. So we can classify nutrients into mobile and immobile nutrients based on whether and how much they're able to move between both in the soil and between plant tissues. So mobile nutrients are those nutrients that are able to move to areas where they're lacking. So in general, these nutrients, if there's a deficiency, these nutrients will move from older leaves to younger leaves. So you'll see symptoms of their deficiency in older leaves. Some of these mobile nutrients that are important are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, chloride, and molybdenum. So if any of these are deficient, you would expect to see those deficiency symptoms in the older leaves. And then we have immobile nutrients. So these nutrients cannot move. Once they're in a place, they're stuck there. So because they cannot move from older leaves to younger leaves, those deficiencies will appear in the younger leaves instead. So these immobile nutrients include things like boron. Calcium is a really critical one in a lot of garden systems. Copper, iron, manganese, nickel, sulfur, and zinc. So these are all immobile nutrients. The primary macronutrients, as I mentioned, are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These nutrients are not necessarily in abundance in certain soil systems, and oftentimes are limiting nutrients in agricultural and garden systems. And they are, as I mentioned, the most frequently applied nutrients. They're also applied in larger quantities typically than other crop nutrients as well. Nitrogen is vital for vegetative plant growth. As I mentioned, I think earlier, nitrogen is a key component of all proteins because it's the building block of amino acids, which make up proteins. So without nitrogen, you literally don't have life. Because every single reaction in biology depends in some way, shape, or form on proteins. Nitrogen is also a major component of chlorophyll, so what makes plants green. And it's an essential component of many vitamins. In general, adding nitrogen increases dry matter, so basically like biomass production in vegetables and protein in grains. So in excess, it can promote attack by things like aphids, but typically quite a bit of nitrogen is required by plants. As I mentioned, critical for vegetative growth. And typically you'll see general chlorosis or yellowing of leaves with nitrogen. And because it's a mobile nutrient, you'll typically see those deficiencies first in older leaves if you catch it early enough. But as you can see with this lettuce plant, it's across the board, across the plant. It's severely deficient at this point. Phosphorus is vital for energy transfer and storage. Interestingly enough, it is part of the name of ATP, the primary energy currency in cells, is adenosine triphosphate. So phosphorus, absolutely essential there. It's important in root growth, in seed and fruit development, and it's also an important component of RNA and DNA. So the building blocks of our genetic code. It's especially important in growing tips where there's really high energy needs. And so a lot of times you'll see that. And interestingly, not important in Hawaii, but there in Idaho, quite important. Having adequate phosphorus can help plants survive harsh winter conditions. It also increases water use efficiency and can speed up maturity of plants. When you have severe phosphorus deficiency, you can get purpling around the edges of leaves. So that's a pretty key indicator of phosphorus deficiency. Potassium is vital for general plant health. It wears a lot of hats. So it can activate enzymes. It's really important in regulating water use because potassium is an ion that's used to help control the stomata. So those holes that are in the leaves that allow for gas and water exchange is regulated by the potassium ion itself. Like phosphorus, it's important in fruit and tuber development and can improve the quality of seeds and fruits. And it's also important in increasing disease resistance. So resiliency of your agricultural system, important to have substantial and adequate potassium. Symptoms of potassium deficiency here. And again, important in fruit development, severe potassium deficiency can lead to improper fruit development and enlargement. So your secondary macronutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Again, just as important, just required in lower quantities than other primary nutrients. So calcium, who has seen blossom end rot most common in tomatoes, but you sometimes also see it in peppers and eggplant? Blossom end rot?
Everyone.
Oftentimes water is seen as the culprit for this, but really it comes down to a calcium deficiency. Calcium is key in cell wall structure and an ion balance. And calcium deficiency can lead to an inability to have enough turgor in your cells, which is why you get the blossom end rot with calcium deficiency, which is exacerbated by infrequent or sporadic watering because calcium moves around. Magnesium is another secondary macronutrient. It's a component of chlorophyll and it activates enzymes and enzymatic reactions. And then sulfur is an important one, especially with legumes because it's required for nitrogen fixation. It's an integral component of an amino acid that's involved in nitrogen fixation. So if you have beans or peas that are exhibiting symptoms similar to nitrogen deficiency, so that like general chlorosis, it actually could be sulfur deficiency that's not allowing those plants to fix nitrogen properly. Blossom end rot. Magnesium deficiency in older leaves because it's a mobile nutrient. And this is our sulfur deficiency, so that general chlorosis. It is an immobile nutrient though, unlike nitrogen, so you'll see that general chlorosis in the younger leaves. Micronutrients, I highlighted some that are particularly important in certain agricultural soils, but these are nutrients that are used by plants in really, really small amounts. They often work kind of behind the scenes as activators for enzymes, and they are important in plant development, just in trace amounts. And this you really need to be careful with because some of these micronutrients can actually become toxic if too much is applied. So here in Hawaii, I work in a specific type of soil called an andosol that is notorious for both phosphorus and boron deficiencies. So one of the symptoms of boron deficiency is a hollow pith inside of many like brassica family plants. So cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, boron deficiency. And interestingly enough, in papayas, which is not relevant to you all, but papayas show like bumpy and lumpy fruit when they're deficient in boron. This is a picture of iron deficiency, specific in citrus, but this becomes a challenge in any alkaline soil. So this is pretty relevant to you all. In your southern Idaho soils that typically are above a 7 pH, iron becomes less available. So iron deficiency will show like what's called interveinal chlorosis, so yellowing between the green veins of leaves. And when you have iron deficiency, if you have a high pH soil, you either need to correct your pH to make that iron available, or what I've done in the past with very high pH soils is add it foliarly. So add like a foliar spray so that the plants can take it up and bypass the pH issues in the soil.
Jackie, can I stop you for a moment?
Of course.
And hold you guys and you, Jackie. It's 9 o'clock now, and we can continue with this now, or we can count on accessing it online. You guys have a preference. And Jackie, are you okay with continuing to go with that?
I could go another 5 minutes or so and finish if you all would like, and then I do need to get back to my daughter.
So you guys want to look at this online later, or you want to hear it now?
Hear it now.
All right, 5 minutes. We won't
All right.
take any, Jackie.
I don't even think it'll be that long, to be honest. Oh, I think this is my last slide. Haha, easy day. So how do we manage soil health, fertility, and plant nutrition? I've given you all a lot of information today about soil health, about fertility, about plant nutrients, and what might be missing. But at the end of the day, it kind of boils down to a few bullet points and a lot of thoughtful observation. It's the appropriate use of fertilizers and amendments, appropriate use and timing of soil amendments and management strategies, and being proactive. If you can nip things in the bud before they become a huge challenge, then it's a lot easier and often a lot less expensive and labor intensive than attacking it once you already see deficiencies and issues related to soil health and fertility down the line. So really just stressing the fact that nutrition starts at or before the seedling stage, and healthy soil leads to healthy plants, leads to healthy soils, and it just goes on and on.
Jackie, thank you so
the end.
much.
Thank you all for listening.
Incredibly informative, and all your enthusiasm is great for us to pursue what you've taught us and to try to put some of it into action. So we really appreciate you being here.
Awesome. Thank you all for being such an attentive audience and having really great questions. Excited to see where you all end up with your gardening careers, and I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You could talk for years about these topics. And so it's just like, if you found something tonight that was interesting to you, then dig in.
Okay, thanks again, Jackie. Wait, what?
One question.
Oh,
Do you have a book that you might recommend, or a couple books to continue understanding, especially with pictures of the deficiencies you were talking about?
So a lot of that you can actually find online. You definitely have to be a little bit cautious about the resources that you're using, but there are all kinds of charts online to give you ideas about nutrient deficiencies. I don't have a book per se on nutrient deficiencies that I would recommend. I mostly end up relying on university extension publications and charts that they offer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can the bonus slides be included in the PDF that you sent?
Yes.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you. Can't wait for you to be back in Idaho.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
All right, Jackie is.